Welcome, my dear family. Before we begin our spooky journey tonight, remember to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share this video with anyone who enjoys bedtime scares. I'd love to know where you're watching from and what time it is, so leave a comment below and cheer me up a bit on YouTube. Now, relax, dim the lights, and let's dive into tonight's story. Story 1. I went camping alone in the Michigan woods. Something was already there. It happened last October, and I still haven't gone back into the woods by myself since. I used to be the kind of person who'd disappear for a weekend with almost no planning at all. I live in northern Michigan, in one of those small towns where there are more trees than people, and where everybody grows up thinking the woods are just part of life. Hunting, fishing, hiking, camping, it was all normal. Solitude never scared me. If anything, I used to need it. Back then, I was 34, newly divorced, and doing what a lot of men do when they don't know what to do with themselves anymore. I kept moving. I took extra shifts. I drove aimlessly. I bought gear I didn't need. I slept badly in my own house, so I started sleeping outside of it whenever I could. That trip wasn't supposed to be memorable. It was supposed to be another cheap little reset. I found the trailhead online the night before. Nothing special. Just a lightly trafficked trail system cutting through a large section of state forest, about an hour and 15 minutes from me. There were a couple primitive sites out there, unmarked, first come, first served. No reservations, no rangers stationed nearby, no cell service after a certain point, that kind of place. I left just after sunrise in my old Silverado with a cooler, a tent, a sleeping bag, and enough food for one night. The weather had that late fall bite to it. The sky was clear, the trees were mostly bare, with a few rust-colored leaves still hanging on. Everything looked dead in that beautiful way northern woods do right before winter takes them. When I pulled into the trailhead lot, there were no other vehicles. That was the first thing I noticed. The second was the silence. Not normal forest quiet, not birds somewhere in the distance, branches creaking, squirrels moving around in the brush. I mean the kind of silence that feels pressed down over everything, like the world is holding its breath. Even standing there with my truck engine ticking as it cooled, I had the weirdest feeling that I'd arrived in the middle of something. I remember standing there with my backpack half on one shoulder, listening. Nothing. No wind, no birds, no insects. Just the faint metallic ping of my truck cooling off and the sound of my own boots in the gravel. I almost got back in and left right then, which sounds ridiculous even to me now. I didn't, because I told myself what I always told myself. You're tired, you're wound up, you're projecting. So I locked the truck, shouldered my pack, and started down the trail. The first mile was easy. Flat ground, pine needles over hard dirt, the occasional exposed root. The trees there were mostly hemlock and birch, with low brush thinning out from the cold. I kept my eyes down, just enjoying the rhythm of walking. That was the part I always liked. After a while, your mind empties out, and you stop being a person with a schedule or a history. You become something simple. Hunger, breath, motion. I'd gone maybe 20 minutes when I heard something ahead. Running. At first, I thought deer. There's a distinct crashing sound deer make when they move fast through brush, and this wasn't that. This was heavier, more rhythmic. Footsteps. Human footsteps. I stopped. The sound kept coming, fast and uneven, snapping twigs, pounding dirt. Then I saw him. A man came around a bend in the trail, maybe 60 or 70 yards ahead, and sprinted straight toward me. I stepped aside automatically, more out of surprise than fear. He was moving hard, head low, arms pumping, boots kicking leaves behind him. He looked to be in his 40s maybe, lean, wearing a dark flannel overshirt over a gray thermal, jeans, and no backpack. No water bottle, no gear. Nothing about him said hiker. When he got close enough for me to see his face, something in my stomach turned cold. He wasn't panicked. That would have made sense. He wasn't out of breath either, which made even less sense. He just looked wrong. His skin had that slick, feverish shine to it, and his mouth hung slightly open, like he was smiling without realizing it. His eyes looked glassy and unfocused, fixed somewhere past me instead of on me. There was dirt smeared along one side of his jaw and what looked like dried blood at his hairline. He ran right past me without slowing down. No hello, no warning, no glance. Just thundered past me like I wasn't there. I turned and watched him go, more confused than scared. He kept sprinting down the trail toward the parking lot, shoulders hunched, boots hammering the dirt. Then, after maybe 30 yards, he stopped so abruptly it looked unnatural, like somebody had hit pause on him. He stood there with his back to me for a moment, then slowly turned his head. Not his body, just his head. He looked at me over his shoulder from down the trail. Even from that distance, I could tell he was smiling, the kind of smile that doesn't mean anything human. My mouth went dry. I remember lifting one hand halfway, like maybe I was going to ask if he was okay. Before I could say anything, he stepped off the trail into the trees and vanished. Not walked deeper where I could hear branches moving, vanished. 1 second there, next second gone. I stood frozen, listening for footsteps, breathing, anything. Nothing. I told myself there were a dozen explanations for it. Drunk, high, local weirdo. Maybe he'd been hunting and gotten spooked. Maybe he was embarrassed that he'd nearly run into me. Maybe the blood on his head wasn't blood. All that sounded thinner every second I stood there. I looked back the way I'd come. The trail behind me was empty, stretching quiet and pale between the trees. Ahead of me, more trail, more woods, more silence. I should have turned around. I know that now. Instead, I kept going, mostly because going back meant walking the direction he'd gone. That's the stupid thing about fear. Sometimes it doesn't make you choose the smart option. Sometimes it just makes you choose the one that feels less immediate. The campsite I found was about another 1.5 miles in, on a little rise off the trail near a dry creek bed. It wasn't much, just a relatively flat patch between trees with an old fire ring made of blackened stones and a couple rotting logs someone had dragged over as seats years before. The ground was layered with old leaves. There were claw marks on one of the beaches nearby, probably from a bear in spring. I dropped my pack and took a slow look around. The trees crowded close on all sides, bare branches high up, dark pine lower down. The creek bed behind the site twisted away into brush and shadow. It was the kind of place that would disappear completely after dark. I kept thinking about the man. No gear, blood on his face, running for no visible reason. Then that look back over his shoulder. I almost packed back up right then. Instead, I did what people do when they want to feel in control again. I gave myself chores. I set the tent, gathered deadfall, cleared leaves from around the fire ring, filtered water from a stagnant pool farther down the creek. Every little task made me feel more reasonable. By the time I got the tent up, it was late afternoon. The light had that thin, watery quality October sunlight gets before evening. I ate a granola bar standing up and glanced around every couple minutes without admitting to myself that that's what I was doing. Then I found the deer, or what was left of it. It was maybe 40 yards from my campsite down the creek bed, tangled in brush where the bank dropped away. I only noticed it because of the smell. At first it came and went with the air, sweet, rotten, thick enough to taste. Then I followed it and saw white through the branches. Bones. I pushed closer, and the whole thing came into view. It had been a buck once, a decent-sized one, but it wasn't old remains, and it wasn't a clean kill. The rib cage was opened wide, not gnawed neatly like coyotes or wolves had worked it over time, but split apart in a messy, violent way. Hide hung in strips from the spine. The head lay several feet away in the leaves, jaw broken, one eye socket packed with black flies. The antlers were snapped. One front leg had been twisted all the way around until the hoof pointed backward. There was blood in the leaves that still looked dark and wet under the crust. Fresh, a lot of it. And caught in a low branch above the carcass was something that stopped me cold. A piece of flannel, dark red and black. I stared at it for a long time. Same kind of pattern the man on the trail had been wearing. I told myself that meant nothing. Half the men in Michigan own a flannel like that. Could have been there for months. Could have belonged to a hunter. Could have snagged on the branch a year ago. Then I saw the drag marks. Not hoof marks, not animal tracks. A broad, uneven groove through the leaves and mud, like something heavy had been pulled from deeper in the brush and left here. I backed away from the carcass so quickly I nearly slipped. That was the first moment I stopped feeling foolish and started feeling afraid. Real fear, not nerves. I went back to camp and took my pistol out of my pack. I had a concealed carry permit then, and usually brought the gun more out of habit than expectation. A compact Glock 19, 15 rounds. I checked the chamber twice even though I knew it was loaded. The weight of it helped, at least a little. I should tell you now that I never saw a bear track out there. No scat, no prints, nothing torn up in the way you'd expect from a big predator feeding. Maybe something had scavenged the deer after it died. Maybe more than one thing. But the way that carcass looked, and the way that cloth was hanging there, I kept thinking of that man's face. By the time the sun sank behind the trees, I'd built a small fire, mostly because I couldn't stand the idea of darkness coming all at once. The woods around me dimmed by layers. Gray trunks first, then shadow filling low places, then the spaces between trees turning solid black. Night in the forest is never really quiet if you know what normal sounds like. That night wasn't normal. Even the fire sounded too loud. Every pop of sap in the wood made me flinch. I heated a can of beef stew and barely touched it. I kept looking toward the trail, then toward the creek bed, then toward the deeper trees behind camp. Every direction felt equally bad. Sometime around full dark, I heard it again. Running. Farther off this time, maybe 100 yards. It came from my left, moved fast through the trees, then stopped dead. Not gradually. Dead. I set the half-eaten stew down so carefully my hand shook against the spoon. The woods went silent again. I waited. Nothing. Then, from somewhere beyond the firelight, a single sharp crack of a branch breaking under weight. I stood up slowly. "Hello?" I called. My own voice sounded weak, swallowed instantly by the trees. No answer. I took the flashlight from beside my bag and swept the beam across trunks and brush. Branches, leaves, white bark, darkness. Nothing. Then the beam hit something low and pale behind a tree about 20 feet out. A face. I jerked the light away on instinct, then snapped it back. Nothing there, just the tree. But I knew what I'd seen, not clearly enough to describe, only clearly enough to know it had been looking at me. I drew the pistol. "Whoever's out there," I said louder, trying to sound steady, "I'm armed." Still nothing. The fire popped behind me. Then, from the darkness off to my right, I heard a sound so soft I almost missed it. A laugh. Not loud, not crazy, not movie villain laughter. Just a breathy little exhale, like someone amused by a private joke. Every hair on my body stood up. I made the worst decision of the night next. I killed the fire. At the time, it made sense. I didn't want to be a glowing target in the middle of black woods. I wanted my eyes to adjust. I wanted not to be visible from every direction. So I kicked dirt over the flames and smothered them fast. The light vanished. The dark that rushed in was absolute. For a few seconds I could see nothing at all, not my tent, not my own hand in front of me, not the pistol, except as weight and shape in my grip. The night pressed against my eyes until they watered. Then the sound came again. Running. This time straight at me. Fast, heavy, closing. I raised the pistol toward the noise and shouted something. I don't even remember what. But before I could fire, the footsteps stopped so suddenly it felt impossible. They had to be just outside the ring where the firelight had been. My ears strained so hard they hurt. There was breathing out there, close, wet and ragged. I thumbed the flashlight on with my support hand and nearly dropped both gun and light at what the beam found. A woman was standing at the edge of camp. At least, I thought it was a woman at first. She was thin to the point of looking carved down, barefoot despite the cold, wearing what might once have been a long white nightgown or slip under a filthy coat. Mud streaked her shins. Her hair hung in ropes around her face. One side of her forehead was split open all the way into the hairline, and dried blood had matted a thick section into a hard, dark knot. Her mouth was slightly open. Several teeth were missing. But it was her eyes that locked me in place. They were open, too wide. Not wild, not panicked, just fixed on me with a terrible, patient attention. like I was something she'd finally found after searching for a long time. She stood half behind a tree, one hand gripping the bark. In the flashlight beam, I could see her fingernails. They were packed dark with blood and dirt. One finger was bent the wrong way. The skin over her knuckles was flayed back in raw strips, as if she'd been clawing at stone or wood. I think I said, "Jesus Christ." She smiled. It wasn't a big smile, just enough to show the broken teeth. Then she took one slow step backward, and another, never turning away, just retreating into the dark, eyes on me the whole time, until the beam caught only tree trunks and empty brush. Then I heard her move. Not footsteps, crawling, fast, circling, dry leaves whispering, branches ticking, something moving on all fours just beyond where the flashlight could catch it. I turned in place, trying to track the sound, the beam shaking all over the trees. That's when something hit the backside of my tent from inside the darkness, hard enough to cave one wall in. I spun and nearly fired. The nylon snapped back into place. Empty. Then from the creek bed came a voice. Male, thin and distant. "Help me." I froze. It was the man from the trail. I knew it, even though I'd only heard his breathing before. Something about the tone. Hoarse. Stretched. Wrong. "Please," the voice said. "He's still here." The woman laughed again, closer now, somewhere to my right. "Help me," the man said, and then his voice broke into a horrible, choking sound, like he was trying to talk with a mouthful of liquid. I backed toward the trail with the pistol out and my flashlight jerking between camp and creek. There was movement in the beam for half a second. Somebody low to the ground, crawling through leaves. I pointed the light down and saw a hand, not attached to an arm I could see, just a hand emerging out from under the tangle of creek bank roots and brush. The fingers were filthy, nails torn away, skin peeled back. It scrabbled weakly through the leaves toward my boot, leaving a dark, wet smear. I stumbled backward so hard I fell over one of the logs by the fire ring. The flashlight flew from my hand and hit the ground beam up, throwing wild, angled light across the camp. That angled light showed me something I will see until the day I die. There were bodies in the creek bed. Not whole bodies, pieces. Enough of them to understand. A human rib cage opened like a split basket in the leaves, a strip of scalp with blonde hair caught on a branch, a jawbone with 3 teeth still in it, what looked like a bare foot attached to half a shin lying in the mud, dark blood soaked into the bank in layers, old and new. And crouched above them on the far side of the creek was the woman. One hand on the ground, the other clutching something long and white. When the flashlight hit it, I realized it was a human forearm, with the hand still attached. She rose halfway, smiling that same little smile, and behind her, another shape unfolded out of the dark. The man from the trail. Only now I could see why he'd looked wrong. His flannel was soaked black down the front. His left ear was gone. Not torn, gone, leaving a ragged hollow on the side of his head. One eye was swollen nearly shut. His lower lip had been ripped open all the way to the gums. He should have looked like somebody dying. Instead, he looked alert, hungry. He tilted his head at me and said in a clear, conversational voice, "You should have turned around." Then they both came at me. I fired. The first shot lit the trees white and deafened me. I don't know if I hit either of them. I only know they flinched apart, and that was enough. I grabbed the flashlight with one hand, my pack strap with the other, left half my gear where it was, and ran. I ran blind down the trail, with the flashlight bouncing, leaves sliding under my boots, branches whipping my face. Behind me, I heard pounding footsteps. Sometimes one set, sometimes two, sometimes many more than that, as if the woods had filled with people the second I turned my back. I fired over my shoulder once more at nothing I could see. The trail twisted downhill, then up over roots, then around a stand of pines. I almost missed the turn toward the lot because I was crying so hard from cold air and adrenaline that my vision blurred. The flashlight caught white trail markers on trees, and I followed them like a drowning man following buoys. Somewhere behind me, a woman screamed, not in fear, in rage. It went on, high and tearing and inhuman by the end, until suddenly it cut off. Then silence again. I kept running. About halfway back, I hit something, stretched across the trail at knee height, and went down full force. The flashlight flew. The pistol skidded out of my hand. My chin smashed into dirt and rocks so hard I bit through my tongue. For a few stunned seconds, I could only taste blood and hear my own panicked grunting. Then I looked up and saw what had caught me. Fishing line. Heavy monofilament strung taut between two trees, and hanging from it, right at face level if I'd hit it standing, were bones. Bird bones, squirrel bones, rabbit skulls, a deer vertebra, bits of string and worsted cans and strips of hide, little charms, little warnings. They clicked softly together in the dark, windless night, though I swear there was no wind. I snatched up the flashlight, found the pistol, and got back to my feet. When I turned the beam to the right side of the trail, I found a tree covered in carvings. Not initials, not trail graffiti. Faces. Dozens of them cut shallow into the bark, one over another. Oval heads, empty eyes, open mouths. Some had antlers, some had human teeth hammered into the wood around them in a ring. Fresh blood had been smeared down the trunk, still wet enough to shine. At the base of that tree sat a skull, human, no lower jaw, mud packed into the sockets. A strip of something pink still clung to one side where the neck would have been. I don't remember deciding to run again. My body just did it. The last stretch to the parking lot felt endless. More than once I heard something pacing me in the woods off the trail, matching my speed. Sometimes I'd catch the flash of pale skin between trunks. Once I heard the man's voice, almost at my shoulder, whisper, "Don't leave me." When I burst into the lot, my truck was exactly where I'd left it. For one insane second, the sight of something normal almost dropped me to my knees. Then I saw the passenger door standing open. I know for a fact I'd locked it. I fumbled the keys so badly, I dropped them twice trying to get to the driver's side. The whole time, I kept expecting hands to grab me from behind, teeth in my neck, that wet, laughing breath in my ear. I got the door unlocked, threw myself in, and looked up. There was someone in the passenger seat. I screamed and fired instinctively. The shot blew the side window out and the cab filled with shattered glass and the smell of gunpowder. What sat there wasn't a person. It was the buck's head, the one from the creek bed. Someone had wedged it upright in my passenger seat, facing me, broken antlers hooked into the headrest. Its throat was hacked ragged and packed with leaves. One eye socket was empty. In the other, jammed deep where the eye had been, was a human finger. There was blood all over the seat. Fresh, tacky blood. And scratched into the fogged inside of the windshield, in broad, greasy strokes, were 3 words. We saw you. I jammed the truck into reverse so hard the gears screamed. Gravel sprayed. I backed out crooked, slammed into a stump at the edge of the lot, corrected, then tore down the access road so fast I thought I'd flip. Something hit the bed of the truck once from behind with a heavy metallic bang, like someone had jumped onto it and slipped off. In the rearview mirror, I thought I saw shapes moving at the edge of the lot, pale and wrong between the trees, but I never slowed down enough to know. I didn't stop until I reached the highway and found cell service. I called 911 from a gas station 15 miles away. By then, my hands were shaking so hard I could barely hold the phone. Blood had dried down my chin from where I had bitten through my tongue, and there was dirt all over me, leaves in my hair, glass in my jacket. The woman behind the counter kept asking if I'd wrecked my truck. State police met me there, then county deputies, then eventually DNR officers because of the location. I told them everything I could, in the order I could manage it. A man on the trail, a campsite, human remains, 2 attackers, markings in the woods, somebody inside my truck. You can imagine the looks I got. Still, they took me seriously enough to go out there before dawn with lights and ATVs and dogs. They found my campsite, or where it had been. The tent was ripped open, my cooler was overturned, my food was gone. My spent shell casings were there. So was my cooking pot. But there were no bodies in the creek bed. No woman, no wounded man, no human remains. There was blood, though. A lot of it. Human blood, they told me later, from more than one person. Some old, some fresh. They found the deer carcass, too, farther down the creek, though by then it had been dragged partially apart by scavengers. They found the piece of flannel in the branch. They found the line strung across the trail with bones hanging from it. They found the carved tree, but by the time they found it, the tree had burned. Not the whole forest, just that tree and the patch around it. Blackened as if somebody had poured accelerant on the trunk and lit it sometime during the night. The teeth in the bark were still there. So was the skull at the base, scorched but intact. The lab later confirmed it was human. What they did not find was anyone alive or dead matching the people I described. No woman, no man missing an ear, no camp nearby, no vehicle besides mine in or around the lot. No footprints they could make sense of because the ground was carpeted with old leaves and too many people had walked through by then. As for my truck, they photographed everything. The deer head in the passenger seat, the blood, the message on the windshield, the broken handle on the passenger door, which looked like somebody had yanked on it until the mechanism snapped. In the bed of the truck, they found something else I hadn't noticed in the gas station lights. 2 long smear marks through the dust and rust, side by side. Handprints. Not normal ones. The fingers were too long. I gave statements for days after that. Then, weeks later, they called me in once more because they thought they had something. A local missing persons case. A woman from Gaylord had vanished nearly 8 months earlier. She was 41, history of mental illness, last seen leaving a relative's house after an argument. Her driver's license photo made my stomach drop when they showed it to me. It was her, or close enough that I couldn't say otherwise. Same eyes, same narrow face. But she hadn't vanished alone.
According to the detective, there had also once been a man associated with her. A boyfriend, maybe husband, records were messy, who had dropped out of contact around the same time. They never found either of them. That was all they told me, and eventually even that thread went nowhere. No arrests, no closure, no official explanation. The best anyone ever offered was that I stumbled onto transients or feral addicts living deep in the woods. That maybe there had been an old hunting camp nearby, maybe a couple unstable people, maybe more. Maybe they'd been dragging animal kills back to the creek. Maybe the human remains belonged to unrelated dump victims. Maybe my panic distorted what I saw. That last part I can almost understand them wanting to believe, but panic doesn't put a deer head in your truck. Panic doesn't write on the inside of your windshield. Panic doesn't explain the thing that happened 3 weeks later. I was home by then, back at work, sleeping with lights on, checking the locks 3, 4, 5 times a night. I told everybody I was done camping. Most people laughed and said they didn't blame me. A few acted like I was making more of it than I should. The police had done what they could. Life moves on. People get bored with your fear long before you do. One morning before work, I went out to the driveway and found mud on the hood of my truck. That had happened before. I live rural. Cats, raccoons, possums, whatever. Then I saw the pattern. The mud wasn't random. It was a print. A bare human footprint, dark and perfect, right in the center of the hood above the grill. Next to it was another, smaller. As if 2 people had stood there together in the night, barefoot on the metal, looking through my windshield into the house. I sold the truck 2 months later. I never told the buyer what happened in it. I also never told anyone the worst part. That same morning, while I was scrubbing the mud from the hood with the garden hose, I noticed something caught up inside the wiper well at the base of the windshield. At first I thought it was a twig. It was a finger. Human. Dried, almost black, stiff as jerky, nail torn away, knuckles split open to white bone. There was a ring on it, a plain silver wedding band. The same finger that had been jammed into the deer's eye socket in my truck. I wrapped it in an old towel and drove straight to the sheriff's office. They took it, tagged it, never gave me any answer I believed. The last time I called to ask about it, the detective handling the case sounded tired. He told me they were still waiting on forensic comparison. He told me these things take time. He told me maybe I should consider talking to somebody for the trauma. A month after that, he retired. No one ever contacted me again. So that's it. That's what happened. You can decide for yourself what was out there. Maybe it was just people. Maybe that's worse. All I know is this. Sometimes, late at night, when the house is quiet enough, I hear running outside. Not on the road, not in the yard, in the tree line behind the property. Fast, uneven footsteps moving between trunks and then stopping all at once. The first few times I grabbed a gun and looked. I don't do that anymore. Because the third time I looked, there was a shape standing out there at the edge of the woods, half hidden behind a maple, one pale hand wrapped around the trunk. And even from my back porch, even in that darkness, I could see it was smiling. Then it took one slow step backward and disappeared. The next morning, there were scratches on my back door. Not animal scratches, too deliberate. 4 long vertical gouges in the paint, all at chest height. And nailed to the frame with a rusty hunting broadhead was a strip of cloth. Dark red and black flannel, still damp. Story 2. I reserved 2 campsites in a state forest. Someone reached the second one before me. I used to think the most dangerous part of backpacking alone was getting hurt where nobody could find you. A broken ankle 3 miles from the nearest road, a bad fall on wet rock, hypothermia if the temperature dropped faster than expected, a black bear nosing around camp after midnight. Those were the problems I planned for. I carried a satellite communicator, extra batteries, a tourniquet, purification tablets, a lightweight bivvy, and enough calorie-dense food to stretch an extra day if I had to. I left trip itineraries with my sister and with one friend who actually knew how to read topographic maps. I booked designated campsites whenever the trail system required them. I checked weather, water sources, closures, and fire regulations. I wasn't some reckless idiot wandering into the woods with a Walmart tent and a protein bar. That's part of why what happened bothered me so deeply afterward. I did everything right, and it still wasn't enough. This was in Pennsylvania about 3 years ago, during the off-season in late October. The trail cut through a huge section of state forest, long enough that most people only hiked part of it, but with enough primitive sites spaced out that you could do a 2 or 3 night run without ever seeing a paved road. In the warmer months, permits were stricter. In late fall, the traffic dropped off hard. A lot of people didn't want to deal with the cold, the early dark, or the fact that half the trail turned into wet leaves over slick roots and stone. That was exactly why I liked it. I was 39 then, recently separated, and trying to convince myself solitude was a choice instead of a consequence. My wife had moved out in July. By October, the apartment felt less like home and more like some bland holding cell with my furniture in it. Backpacking was the only thing that still made my mind go quiet. Out there, I didn't have to be the version of myself that had failed in a kitchen under fluorescent light. I just had to keep walking. I reserved 2 campsites, one at roughly mile 12 and another at mile 26. I drove up before sunrise, parked at the south trailhead, locked my truck, shouldered my pack, and started out under a pale gray sky with my breath already showing. The first day was uneventful, in the way good hikes are. Cold air, empty trail, wet leaves. The forest, mostly hardwood, oak, maple, ash, beech, with occasional dark stands of pine, where the ground went softer and quieter underfoot. I saw a deer sign, old turkey scratchings, one fox starting across a shallow draw, and nobody else. That last part I noticed, not because it was alarming yet, just because it was interesting. An empty trail in October doesn't mean much. People cancel. Weather changes plans. Rangers don't exactly herd hikers in and out. But by the 3rd or 4th hour, when I still hadn't passed anyone coming south or north, I started to feel like I had the whole forest to myself. At the time, It felt like a gift. I reached the first campsite around 1:30 in the afternoon. It sat off the trail in a little clearing near a narrow stream with a steel fire ring bolted into a concrete post, a flat tent pad, and a weathered wooden sign with the site number burned into it. I dropped my pack, filtered water, set up camp, and spent the rest of the afternoon doing almost nothing. That's one of the underrated pleasures of solo backpacking, once you stop trying to make it into a performance of rugged suffering. You get somewhere, you eat, you sit, you let the world be quiet around you. That evening, I built a small fire, heated up freeze-dried chili, and watched the light drain out of the trees. When it finally got dark, the temperature dropped fast enough that I could feel it through the knees of my pants. I zipped up my jacket, finished my meal, hung my food bag, and crawled into the tent around 9. I slept hard, at least until the footsteps. I woke to what I first thought was a dream sound, one of those noises your brain folds into sleep before it fully understands you're hearing something real. It was a steady crunch, pause, crunch, pause, like somebody walking carefully on a carpet of wet leaves. I opened my eyes to total black. For a second, I didn't know where I was. Then the nylon ceiling inches from my face, the smell of cold fabric and the ache in my hips from the thin sleeping pad reminded me. The footsteps came again, not on the trail, in camp, close enough that I could hear the subtle difference between leaf litter and packed dirt. I checked my watch, 2:17 a.m. I stayed still and listened. Whoever it was moved slowly around the outside of my tent. I could tell by the way the sound shifted, faintly left, then near my feet, then farther to the right. There was no talking, no flashlight beam, no jingle of gear, just careful footfalls, and then silence long enough to let my pulse start beating in my throat. I told myself, ranger, or another backpacker lost in the dark, or a hunter violating the area rules. Then the footsteps stopped near my head. The nylon wall beside me dimpled inward, just once, a fingertip pressing lightly from the outside. I stopped breathing. The fabric popped back into place. Then nothing. No footsteps leaving, no whisper, no zipper. Just silence so complete I could hear the tiny electrical hiss inside my own ears. I lay there for what felt like an hour, but was probably 10 minutes, clutching the knife I kept in the side pocket of the tent. I thought about calling out. I thought about reaching for my headlamp and unzipping the flap. I thought about hitting the panic on my satellite communicator, even though that would have been insane. Eventually, I heard footsteps again, moving back toward the trail. Steady, unhurried, then gone. I barely slept after that. I spent the rest of the night floating on that shallow edge of fear, where every little sound drags you halfway awake. Once, near dawn, I thought I heard something metallic clink softly from the fire ring area. But when gray light finally came through the tent walls and I looked outside, everything appeared untouched. No footprints that I could confidently separate from my own. No disturbed gear. No missing food. Nothing. I almost convinced myself I'd exaggerated it in the dark. Almost. Then I found the spoon. It had been in my cookpot the night before, I was certain of that because I'd rinsed the pot, stacked the spoon in it, and set both by a log near the fire ring to dry before crawling into the tent. In the morning, the pot was still there.
The spoon was not. I found it planted upright in the mud beside the stream, bowl-end down like a grave marker.
There was dark brown residue on the handle. At first I thought dirt. When I rubbed it with my thumb, it came away tacky. Blood. Not much, a smear, half dried. I stared at it for a long time with that stupid, helpless feeling you get when reality is offering you something you don't want to understand. If somebody had been in camp, if they'd touched my tent, if they'd taken my spoon and done whatever that was, then they'd been close enough to hurt me while I slept. Close enough to unzip the tent, close enough to stand there and decide not to. That should have been enough for me to abandon the trip. Instead, I did what I'm ashamed to admit I did again and again over the course of that hike. I rationalized. Maybe a prank, maybe some weird local passing through. Maybe I nicked my hand without noticing and got blood on the spoon myself.
Maybe I'd been more tired than I thought. Maybe some of the details weren't as clear as they felt in hindsight. Because once you accept something is truly wrong, then you have to make decisions as if you believe it. And I didn't want to cut the trip short. I didn't want to hike 12 miles back because of nerves and a dirty spoon. I didn't want to be the guy who bailed and then spent the drive home wondering if he'd panicked over nothing. So I packed up and kept going north. The second day was harder terrain, more elevation, more rock. The sky stayed mostly overcast, and by afternoon, the whole forest had that flat, pewter light that makes every trunk look farther apart and every hollow look deeper. I still didn't see another hiker. No dogs, no camp smoke, nothing. But I started noticing things. At first, just little details that didn't fit. A fresh boot print on a damp stretch of trail where I would have sworn no one had been ahead of me. The tread wasn't like mine, heavier, older work boot type, not hiking boot. Then, around midday, I stopped to filter water at a creek crossing and found a cigarette butt mashed into the mud beside the bank. It was still dry under the torn paper. Recent. Whoever dropped it had been there after the last rain. A little later, I found a deer skeleton off the trail, maybe 20 yards into the trees. That wasn't strange in itself. Animals die in the woods all the time. But this one had been arranged. That's the only word for it. The skull sat on a flat rock. The spine had been laid in a line away from it. The rib bones were stuck upright in the ground on either side like pale curved stakes. Small bits of hide still clung to the joints, black and leathery. Flies crawled lazily in the eye sockets. Tucked into the open mouth of the skull was a candy wrapper, a peanut butter cup, the kind I used to carry on hikes. My stomach tightened. I bent and looked closer. It was the exact brand I had in my food bag. There are a million reasons that could mean nothing. Popular candy, common trail snack, coincidence. But by then I already knew I was looking for patterns. And the truth is, when you're alone in the woods and something feels wrong, coincidence stops feeling like a real category. I moved on faster after that. By the time I reached the second campsite, it was later than I'd planned. The site sat in a stand of pines about 50 yards off the main trail, at the edge of a long, shallow depression filled with boulders and deadfall. The trees there muffled sound in a way hardwood stands don't. Even in daylight, it felt
close and dim. There was another steel ring, another numbered marker, another flat space for a tint. And there was smoke. Not an active fire, not much, just a faint ghost of it lingering in the cold air, mixed with the unmistakable smell of wet ash and meat gone sour. I stopped dead in the path leading into camp. Someone had been there.
The fire ring held fresh charcoal under a crust of gray, and a few split sticks lay beside it, as if whoever used them had intended to come back. On one of the logs near the ring sat an empty can of beans, peeled open with a knife. There were dark streaks inside it, too thick to be sauce. Beside the can was a strip of cloth snagged on a splinter, dark blue plaid. My ex-wife bought me a flannel almost that exact pattern 2 Christmases before. That detail hit me so hard it made me angry. Not because I thought it was mine, it wasn't, but because something about seeing an object that looked so much like a piece of my ordinary life sitting in that remote place made the whole thing feel personal in a way it hadn't before. I set my pack down and walked the perimeter of the site. No tent, no gear, no person. Whoever had been there had either left in a hurry or was still close enough to watch me arrive. I should have turned around then, I know that. I know it as clearly as I know my own name. But evening was already coming on. The thought of pushing farther north without a permit, or turning and hiking back in fading light, or bushwhacking off trail to improvise something else, all of it felt worse than staying put and keeping my knife close. The site was designated. It was on my permit. It had probably just been some hunter or some asshole using it illegally earlier in the day. So I set up anyway. I kept the camp minimal. No fire, no music, no lingering. I ate cold tortillas with tuna and cheese, kept my headlamp off as much as possible, and listened. Every few minutes I'd stop moving and just stand there in the pines, waiting for the woods to tell me if I was alone. They never did. Dark came early under those trees. Full dark came like a lid being shut. A little after 9, I saw the light. At first, it was just a white blink between trunks far down the trail to the south. Then again. Then steady movement. Someone wearing a headlamp or carrying a flashlight coming toward the site. I crouched beside the fire ring and watched. The light bobbed between trees, disappeared behind trunks, returned closer. Whoever it was moved slowly, not like a backpacker trying to make miles, but like somebody pacing themselves because they knew exactly where they were going. I told myself this could still be normal. Late arrival, another permit holder confused about the sites, a ranger checking compliance. Then the light stopped. It had gotten close enough by then that I could tell it was pointed directly toward camp, toward me. We stayed like that for maybe 3 seconds, me crouched half in the dark, that light staring from the trail. Then it moved sharply off to the left, leaving the trail entirely. The beam cut sideways through the trees, weaving deeper into the forest instead of toward the campsite. 10, maybe 15 seconds later, it went out. Just like that. No footsteps after. No voice. No reason. The pines seemed to press inward. I waited for the light to come back on. It didn't. I must have stood there for 20 minutes, with my pulse hammering in my gums, staring into the spot where it had vanished.
Eventually, my knees started to ache from being crouched, and the cold got through my jacket. I considered calling out, but every instinct I had told me not to advertise my exact position. So I stayed quiet. Then I heard something behind me. A single leaf crunch. Not from the trail, from the trees at the back of camp, no more than 10 yards away. I spun and brought my headlamp up. The beam hit a man standing between two pines. He was close enough that I should have heard him long before that. He wore a tan canvas jacket over a gray sweatshirt, jeans dark with damp around the shins, and no pack. His hair was flattened oddly on one side, like he'd been sleeping in a hood. He was probably in his 40s, maybe early 50s, with a narrow face and skin that looked waxy in the cold light. He didn't raise a hand to shield his eyes from the beam. He didn't apologize or step back. He just stood there, smiling. It wasn't a crazy smile. That would have been easier. It was friendly looking in shape, but it sat on his face wrong, like something he'd practiced. "What the hell are you doing?" I said. His smile twitched a little wider. For one awful second, I thought I recognized him. Not from anywhere specific, just that vague, crawling sensation that you've seen someone before, in a grocery store aisle or pumping gas at the next station over. A face life has brushed past yours without introducing. Then he said my name. Not guessed it, said it. Casually, like we were co-workers who'd crossed paths in a parking lot. Every part of me went cold. I know exactly what fear felt like in that moment because I've replayed it enough times to have studied it. It wasn't the spike of panic you get from a sudden noise or a near car accident. It was deeper and slower than that. More like an elevator dropping inside my chest, an internal certainty arriving all at once. This man knew who I was, and I had no idea who he was. He said my name again with the same small smile and took one step toward me. I stepped back. "Do I know you?" I asked. He tilted his head as if the question amused him. "You've seen me," he said. His voice was soft, ordinary, Midwestern flat, not slurred, not frantic. That somehow made it worse. "Where?" I said. Another step. "Here and there." The headlamp beam trembled because my hand was shaking. I started trying to place him harder. Gas station, hardware store, courthouse, a face from some old work site. Something in me was desperate to fit him into a normal category, because if I could do that, then maybe the rest of this made sense. He saved me the effort. "By the laundromat once," he said. "Outside the grocery store in January. At that diner off Route 6 when you had the blue coat. You were with your wife then." The air left my body. I hadn't told anyone where I was going except my sister and one friend. This man was calmly listing moments from my regular life, moments I barely remembered, not because they mattered to me, but because they'd mattered enough to him to keep. I grabbed my pack. I didn't answer. I just snatched it up by the hall loop and slung one strap over my shoulder. The smile flattened on his face instantly. He looked almost hurt. "What are you doing?" he asked. His voice had changed. Still quiet, but thinner now, less conversational. I kept backing toward the trail. "I'm leaving." He took 2 quick steps toward me, then stopped, like he'd caught himself. "You don't need to do that." I had the knife in my hand at that point, though I don't remember drawing it. I held it low by my thigh, "Stay back," I said. He looked at the knife, then at my face. The woods behind him were black. I had the insane feeling there might be other people in that dark, listening to us. He said my name again, but this time it sounded wrong. Too intimate, almost scolding, like I was embarrassing him. Then his expression changed completely. All friendliness drained out of him in 1 second, leaving nothing but flat, naked irritation. He lunged. I ran. There's a special kind of terror in running through woods at night that people underestimate because movies make it look clean. It isn't clean. It's falling and grabbing and branches whipping your eyes and roots snatching at your ankles. It's breath tearing at the back of your throat while you try to remember trail turns you barely registered in daylight. It's knowing that if you break a leg out there, you don't get a dramatic, heroic moment. You get found later, or you don't. I kept my headlamp off for the first part, because I wanted the darkness to hide me as much as it hid him. I followed the pale suggestion of trail and the darker lines of tree trunks, feeling more than seeing the ground. Behind me, I heard him for maybe 15 seconds, fast, heavy footfalls on the path. Then nothing. That silence scared me more than the chase, because if he wasn't chasing anymore, it meant he didn't need to. I kept moving north for a minute before my brain finally caught up and told me I was doing the stupidest possible thing. North meant deeper into the forest, farther from my truck, farther from the ranger station, farther from anybody. So I veered off the trail just enough to duck behind a blowdown and got my satellite communicator out with clumsy hands. I hit emergency. It took longer than I thought it would for the signal to go through. Every second waiting for the confirmation icon felt like standing bare-chested in a gun range. When it finally transmitted, I sent a short text explaining that I was being followed by an unknown male in the forest. Believed I was in immediate danger and was leaving the trail southbound toward my first campsite to meet anyone coming in. Then I ran south. I don't know how long I moved before I realized something even worse. There was another light in the woods. Not behind me, ahead. Faint and low between the trees to the right of the trail, pacing my movement. Then a second one farther left. Not headlamps, smaller, yellowish. Lanterns maybe, or flashlights half covered by fingers. I stopped so hard my knees buckled. The two lights stopped too. I turned off my own headlamp immediately and stood in the dark with my whole body straining to hear. For a few seconds, nothing. Then, very close to my left, someone whispered my name. I took off downhill through brush without caring anymore whether I stayed on trail. Branches slapped my face. Dead twigs snapped onto my boots. I slid on wet leaves and slammed shoulder first into a tree, hard enough to see white sparks. Somewhere above me, I heard movement keeping pace. Then another voice farther off. A woman's voice this time, laughing. Not loud, not theatrical, just quick, breathy bursts, like she was trying not to be heard. I crashed through a tangle of mountain laurel and nearly pitched headfirst into a gully. At the bottom ran a narrow stream over stone. I dropped into it, splashing calf-deep through freezing water, and followed it downstream because for some reason I believed moving in water might break the sound of my steps. That's when my headlamp beam hit the first body. It wasn't a whole body. It was the upper half of one. At first, my brain refused to name what I was looking at. It registered color and shape before meaning. A pale back curved against stone, a black mass of wet leaves or hair, something bright white like roots.
Then I got closer, and the white resolved into bone. A rib cage split open. Human. The torso was face down in the stream, pinned against rocks by one outstretched arm. The lower half was gone above the hips, cut or torn away so raggedly that I could see stringy tissue waving under the current. One hand still wore a watch. The skin had turned that dead bluish-gray color under the film of cold water. The back of the head was crushed in, and hair floated in the stream like black weeds. I made a sound I didn't know I was capable of making. Somewhere above the bank, somebody laughed again. I scrambled back, slipped, caught myself on a rock, and looked up. My headlamp caught faces, 3 of them, not clearly, just fragments between branches on the rise above the stream. One was the man from camp. One looked smaller, maybe a woman. The third I saw only as a pale oval, with eyes reflecting hard in the beam. They didn't charge. They just watched me. The man called down softly, "You don't have to keep running." I tore myself away and kept moving. What followed was less like escape and more like surviving one decision at a time. I crossed the stream, climbed through brush, found the trail again by luck, lost it, found it, doubled back by mistake once, and somewhere in all of that I heard the satellite communicator chirp with a message response I was too terrified to stop and read. At one point I passed a tree with orange survey tape tied around it. Relief hit me so hard my legs weakened because I thought it meant a side access road or a marked junction. Then my light hit what hung below the tape. Animal bones, small ones, bird skulls, squirrel jawbones, pieces of spine threaded on fishing line and tied together so they knock softly against the trunk. Below them, nailed into the bark with a hunting broadhead, was a photograph, rain-softened, mud-smeared, but still visible enough. It was me. Not a close-up, a long lens kind of shot, taken from across a street somewhere. I was outside the grocery store carrying 2 paper bags, looking down at my keys. From the trees around the edge of the frame, I knew immediately it hadn't been taken in the forest. It had been taken near my apartment. I ripped it off the tree and ran harder. By the time I reached my first campsite again, I was shaking so badly I could barely work my zipper. I dove into the tent, killed my light, and listened. For several minutes, nothing. Then footsteps outside. One set at first, then more. Slow, circling. Nobody touched the tent, nobody spoke. They just moved around it in the dark, close enough that I could hear leaves compress under their weight and the faint rasp of breathing through noses. I clamped one hand over my mouth to keep my teeth from chattering loud enough to give away exactly where my head was. Then something slid under the rainfly near the vestibule, just the edge of it, a strip of cloth pushing through. I stared at it until my eyes hurt. Finally, I leaned forward and, inch by inch, pulled it inside. It was a piece of flannel, blue plaid, and wrapped in it was my missing spoon. Only now, there was more blood on it, fresh enough to shine. At the very tip of the spoon bowl sat a human tooth. I dropped it so fast it hit the tent floor with a little metallic ping that sounded deafening. The footsteps outside stopped immediately. For a second, I thought they were about to rush the tent. Instead, someone crouched down so close to the fabric that I could hear cloth shifting against leaves. Then a male voice,
almost tender, spoke through the nylon no more than a foot from my face. "I know you're awake." I didn't move. He stayed there. "We were at your house in March," he said. "The yellow one with the peeling porch rail. You left for work at 7:16. The bathroom light was on upstairs." My body went numb.
There are moments when fear becomes so total, it almost feels clean. Everything non-essential burns away. Shame, confusion, dignity, all gone. What's left is only the need to survive the next minute. The voice continued. "She cried in the kitchen after you left." He meant my wife. Ex-wife, technically now, but at the time of whatever he was describing, still my wife. I squeezed my eyes shut so hard I saw colors. The voice shifted slightly, like he was leaning closer to the tent. "You should have stayed home with her." Then footsteps moved away. I don't know how long I lay there afterward. Eventually, the satellite communicator vibrated against the tent floor with an incoming response that nearly made me scream. I forced myself to read it under my jacket to hide the light. "Ranger en route from South Access. ETA approximately 1 hour 20 minutes. Move only if necessary. Make noise if contacted by uniformed personnel." 1 hour and 20 minutes. It might as well have been a week. I knew if I stayed in that tent, I was going to die. Maybe not immediately, maybe not cleanly, but those people, however many there were, had all the time in the world and all the darkness on their side. So I did the only thing I could think of. I cut out the back of the tent. Very slowly, using my knife just above ground level, I slit the rear panel open enough to slide through. Cold air rushed in. Pine needles stuck to my sleeves. I wriggled out on my stomach with my pack already on, leaving most of my gear where it was to make the tent look occupied. Then I crawled. Not because I thought it was tactical, because terror had reduced me to something animal. I belly crawled through pine needles and cold mud until I reached the edge of the trees behind camp. From there I crouched and started angling south again, parallel to the trail but off it, moving as quietly as I could. About 50 yards on, I looked back. My tent still sat in the clearing, a dim hump under the trees, and around it, in shapes darker than the dark, I could make out people standing. 4 of them, maybe 5. One had something long over a shoulder. Rifle or shovel, I couldn't tell. Another looked too small to be a man. They weren't searching. They were waiting. I turned and kept moving. I made maybe half a mile before I saw blue-white beams cutting through the forest ahead and heard a man's voice shouting, "State Ranger!" I stumbled toward the sound so fast I went down on one knee. 2 rangers found me near a trail junction, both armed, both wearing headlamps and blaze orange outer layers. I must have looked insane. Mud to my chest, blood on one sleeve from where I'd torn my forearm on brush, eyes wide enough to hurt. I tried to explain everything at once. They got me behind them, radioed in my location, and moved fast toward the campsite. By the time we reached it, the clearing was empty. My tent had collapsed inward, not from wind. Somebody had cut it open in long vertical slashes, front and sides, as though they'd stabbed and ripped every place a body might have been inside. My sleeping bag was dragged halfway out and stuffed with wet leaves. My cook kit had been scattered. My food line hung cut and empty. The spoon was gone again. One ranger swept his light over the ground
and went still. There were footprints everywhere, not just one or two sets, many, some boots, some bare feet, all churned around the tent in circles. There was blood, too, small droplets on pine needles, smears on the torn nylon, a darker patch near the fire ring. One ranger knelt by it, touched it with a gloved finger, and said nothing, but his jaw tightened. We searched the area until dawn with additional responders. They found the stream. They found the torso. By then, in full light, it looked even worse. Male, likely middle-aged, advanced but not complete decomposition, lower half absent, severe trauma to the skull.
They later told me he'd probably been dead days, maybe longer. Not enough to explain who or what had removed the rest. They found drag marks farther down the bank and what looked like an old camp deeper in the pines. Nothing substantial, just a blackened fire scar, beer cans, a tarp shredded almost beyond use, and bones. Mostly animal, they said at first. Not all. They found my photograph nailed to the tree with the orange tape. I never told them that was the part that truly broke something in me. Not the body, not the voices. That photograph. Because it meant the forest wasn't where this started. It was just where they finally stepped close enough for me to see them. The official investigation dragged on for months. There was mention of illegal squatters using the state forest. There was talk of meth cooks years earlier in adjacent land. There were rumors of transients, hunters, a family that had once lived off-grid until authorities pushed them out. Human remains turned up from old missing person cases in counties all over America. One more partial body in a forest didn't magically produce answers. No one was ever charged with what happened to me. No one identified the man who knew my name. No one explained how a photograph taken near my apartment ended up nailed to a tree miles deep in the state forest. And nobody ever gave me a satisfying reason why, when rangers checked the trailhead log and nearby cameras, there was no record of anyone entering that section of trail besides me. Not by car, anyway. The part I haven't told many people is what happened after. For a while, I tried to act normal, went back to work, changed the locks, bought cameras for the apartment, slept with all the lights on, started seeing every familiar stranger twice, once as they were, once as someone who might be pretending to be harmless because they already knew too much. 3 weeks after the hike, I came home from work and found one of my outdoor cameras offline. Just one. The one pointed toward the back lot. I reset it from my phone and rewound the footage. At 2:13 a.m., the feed had flickered to static for about 4 seconds. When the image returned, something was tied to the camera bracket. By morning, it was gone. I went outside anyway. Hanging from the fence directly beneath the camera was a strip of blue plaid flannel, pinned through the center with my missing titanium spoon. The bowl was polished clean, but caught in the seam where the handle met the bowl was something pale and curved. A clipping of human fingernail. There was a note folded around the handle. No envelope, just paper, damp from the night air. It had my first name written on the outside. Inside, in shaky block letters that looked almost childlike, were 6 words. You ran the right way. I moved out of that apartment 2 days later. I live in a different county now. Different building, different locks. I don't post where I am. I don't use the same grocery store 2 weeks in a row if I can help it. I still hike, but never alone, and never overnight.
Not anymore. People hear stories like this and assume the scariest part is the forest, the body, the blood, the group in the dark. Those parts are easy to explain to yourself, in a way. Woods contain bad people. Bad people do monstrous things where nobody's looking. America is full of places large enough to hide cruelty for a long time. The part that keeps me awake is smaller than that. It's the possibility that I didn't just stumble into someone else's territory. It's that one of them, maybe the man, maybe another one I never saw clearly, had already been orbiting the edges of my life for months, maybe longer, watching, collecting, waiting until I finally stepped far enough away from everybody else to make the approach. Sometimes I still think about the things he said through the tent wall, the porch rail, the bathroom light, my wife crying in the kitchen. All details too specific to be lucky guesses. I told myself for a long time he was lying, mixing common possibilities with coincidence to manipulate me. That maybe he'd followed me from town the day of the hike and invented the rest. Then, last winter, I was unpacking a box of old kitchen junk I'd never fully gone through after the separation. At the bottom was a cheap ceramic mug my wife used to use for tea. I almost threw it out. Then I noticed something inside. Scratched into the glaze at the bottom, so faint you could only see it when the light caught it a certain way, was my name. Not written normally, carved, over and over, one on top of the next, until the letters had become a shallow gouge. I showed it to my ex-wife. She went white the second she saw it. Then she told me something she'd never told anyone, because at the time, she'd thought it was too stupid to matter. Back in March, exactly when he said, they came home one afternoon and found our back door unlocked. Nothing stolen, no damage, no clear sign anyone had been inside, but in the sink, beside a drying rack of clean dishes, 1 teaspoon had been bent almost in half. I asked why she never told me. She said because she was afraid I'd think she was losing it. That was the last conversation we had, longer than 10 minutes. There's one more thing. I still get permits sometimes. Day use, group trips, never overnight solo, never that. But I check forest websites out of habit now. Closures, advisories, maintenance notices. A few months ago, while killing time on one of those pages, I clicked a PDF about campsite renovations in that same section of state forest. Most of it was boring, administrative language. Then I saw a site map. Same numbered sites, same trail, same layout. Only one detail had changed. The campsite I reserved for the second night, the one where I met the man, where the light veered into the trees, where the voices circled my tent, had been permanently removed from the reservation system the year before my trip, not after, before. According to the PDF, it had been decommissioned due to repeated vandalism, unauthorized occupancy, and hazardous conditions associated with ongoing law enforcement activity. It should not have been available for me to reserve, but I still have the original email confirmation. Site number, date, permit code, everything. I checked it so many times I memorized it. When I tried to pull it up again after seeing that PDF, the email was gone. Not buried, gone. And I know what people will say to that. Deleted accidentally, system glitch, memory distortion, stress, trauma. Any explanation that keeps the world neat and administrative and sane. Maybe. But sometimes, around 2 or 3 in the morning, My phone lights up with a spam number call that never leaves a voicemail. And once, only once, I answered. There was no breathing on the line, no obvious sound at all. Then, very softly, as if from a room with a lot of fabric in it, a man's voice said my first name. Not loudly, not threateningly, just enough to tell me he still knew it. Then the line went dead. Story 3. The man under my van knew my name. A few years ago, when I was between jobs and lying to myself about how well I was handling it, I rented a camper van and drove west for what I kept calling a reset. That's the word people use when they don't want to say breakdown. I was 36, living in Ohio at the time, recently single, drinking too much, but not enough that anyone around me would have called it a problem yet. I had some savings, no real obligations for a month, and an apartment that had started to feel like a waiting room for a life I wasn't participating in. Every room in it reminded me of things ending. The dent in the couch cushion where my ex used to sit. 2 coffee mugs in the cabinet I still hadn't thrown out. A framed print leaning against the wall because I never got around to rehanging it after painting. I wanted distance from all of that. I wanted motion. I wanted to be somewhere nobody could ask me what my plan was. So I flew into Denver, rented a small, off-grid camper van from one of those companies that markets freedom and rugged solitude to people with smartphones, and started driving north through Wyoming and Montana, with the vague idea that I'd spend 3 weeks bouncing between public lands, scenic pull-offs, and campgrounds. For the first 2 days, it was almost exactly what I'd hoped. I slept in truck stops and one cheap campground outside Casper. I made coffee on the little propane stove built into the van. I listened to AM radio and old playlists and drove long stretches of empty road where the sky looked too big to belong to the same country as my apartment back home. I thought maybe I'd been right. Maybe all I'd needed was open space and enough miles to leave myself behind. On the 3rd day, I crossed into a part of southern Montana where the land opened out into low ridges, sage, scattered timber, and long gravel roads that seemed to lead nowhere, until suddenly they did. The van's GPS was unreliable off the highway, but I had downloaded an app a lot of people use for dispersed camping. User-submitted sites on public land with photos and comments and coordinates. I'd picked out 3 spots before I lost service. All of them were supposed to be on or near the same forest access road. All of them had recent reviews. Quiet, amazing stars, easy in a 2-wheel drive van if it's dry, felt very safe as a solo female traveler. That last one actually reassured me. It's embarrassing to admit now how much faith I put in those little lines from strangers. But once you're on a trip long enough, apps start to feel like infrastructure. Like if enough people say a place exists, it becomes trustworthy by consensus. The first campsite wasn't there. I drove to the coordinates and found nothing but a locked cattle gate and private property signs wired crooked to the fence. The second one was supposedly another 9 miles up a washboard road through rolling timber. I found the pull-off, or what might have been one years earlier, but it had washed half out into a ravine. No way I was taking the van through that. The third one was farther still, by then late enough in the day that the sun had already started lowering behind the ridges. I was getting irritated, then anxious, then that particular kind of stubborn people get when they're tired and don't want to admit The sensible option is to turn around. I also had no service by then. That mattered more than I wanted to acknowledge. I remember gripping the wheel tighter every time the road bucked under the tires. The van wasn't huge, but it wasn't built for anything technical either. Every rattle from the cabinets in the back sounded like the inside of a cheap apartment building in an earthquake. I kept glancing at the fuel gauge and then at the sky and then back at the map screen, which by then had reduced my route to a blue line over a blank tan background. No landmarks, no reassurance, just me and the road, and the growing sense that I was being funneled farther away from the part of the world where mistakes stayed manageable. By the time I passed the coordinates for the third site and still found nothing, the light had started going thin and gray. The road bent through a stand of lodgepole pine and then into more open country dotted with juniper and rock outcrops. I remember feeling the first real pulse of fear then, not because anything had happened, but because the thought of driving another hour in fading light, maybe hitting some dead end or getting stuck, had started to feel less safe than stopping wherever I could. That was when I saw the turnoff. It wasn't marked, just a narrow two-track veering off the main forest road, partly hidden by brush and low branches. If I'd been moving faster, I would have missed it. The path looked rougher than the road I was already on, and it dipped between trees steeply enough that the passenger side vanished from view after 10 yards. I stopped with the van idling and stared down it. There were tire marks, not fresh, but not ancient either. Somebody had used it. I told myself that was enough. If people had taken vehicles in there, maybe it led to one of the campsites from the app and the pin had just been off. Or maybe it was some hunter's spot, maybe a little clearing. Maybe anything at all other than me sleeping on the shoulder of a road with no service and nobody for miles. I backed up, straightened out, and turned down the track. The trees closed around the van almost immediately. Branches scraped both sides in long fingernail sounds. The ruts were deep enough that I had to crawl in first gear. Once or twice I thought the undercarriage clipped stone. The track wound down through timber for what felt longer than it could possibly have been. 5 minutes, maybe 6, before it opened into a small clearing just big enough for the van and nothing else. That should have been another warning. There was no turnaround loop, no second sight, no fire ring, no obvious place for tents. Just one patch of flattened ground, a ring of trees around it, and beyond them, darkness already collecting under the branches. I sat there with the engine running and looked around through the windshield. The clearing was wrong. I don't know how else to explain it. Not haunted, not cinematic, just wrong in a way my body understood before my thoughts did. The trees stood a little too evenly spaced, as if someone had chosen which to cut years ago and then changed their mind. The ground was bare, in an oval around the center of the clearing, not from recent tire traffic, but from repeated use. And there was a smell in the air that didn't belong to clean mountain forest. Something faint and sour underneath the pine and cold dirt. Animal, maybe. Rot, maybe. Old ash. I couldn't place it. My first instinct was to back out and leave. I didn't. I was frustrated, tired, and too deep in that dumb logic where every previous inconvenience becomes a reason not to retreat from the next one. I told myself it only felt eerie because I was alone and losing daylight. I told myself first-time solo van nerves were making me dramatic. I told myself that if I just locked the doors, heated some food, and slept, everything would look harmless in the morning. So I killed the engine. The silence that followed was immediate and heavy. No distant road, no wind, no birds. Just the tiny metallic ticks of the hot engine cooling and one far-off creak of branches rubbing somewhere in the trees.
I went into the back of the van and started doing practical things, because that's what I do when I'm uncomfortable. Closed the blackout curtains, checked the side latch, turned on the small interior lights, made a packet of ramen, and ate it standing up over the little sink. I even laughed once to myself, this dry, fake little laugh, as if I could puncture the mood by acting like I noticed it. For maybe 15 minutes, that worked. Then, I heard footsteps outside. Not near at first, just crunching through the clearing from the far side where the trees were densest. Slow, deliberate, human. You can tell. Anybody who spends enough time outdoors can tell the difference between a person choosing steps and an animal moving on instinct. I froze with the ramen cup halfway to my mouth. The footsteps stopped beside the van, not by the rear doors, by the driver's side window. 3 soft taps landed against the glass. I don't know why I assumed it had to be another camper. Maybe because the alternative was worse. Maybe because once another human exists in the scene, your brain rushes to dress them in normal explanations. Lost hunter, local ranch hand, somebody checking if you need help. I walked up into the cab and peeked through the edge of the curtain. A man stood outside the driver's door. He looked to be in his 40s, maybe a little older. Medium height, wiry build, denim jacket over a gray hoodie, dark baseball cap, stubble silvering at the chin. In any normal light, in any gas station or hardware store in America, he would have looked completely ordinary. The kind of man you'd barely register, except maybe to note that he looked a little tired. But there was something off in how still he was. Most people shift when they stand. Their shoulders settle, eyes move, breath shows. This man looked posed, as if he'd chosen what a non-threatening posture was supposed to be and then frozen inside it. He smiled when he saw me through the glass, but the smile didn't move the rest of his face. I cracked the window an inch. "Everything okay?" I asked. "Yeah," he said. "Didn't mean to spook you." His voice was soft, almost shy. He nodded toward the back of the van. "Just saw you come in. Figured I'd say hi before it got too dark." I asked where he was camped. That was the first moment his eyes changed. Not a big change, just a quick little flick past me over my shoulder into the van, like he was checking whether anyone else was inside. Then he smiled again. "Just nearby." I waited for him to point. He didn't. Nearby didn't mean much out there, but the clearing had only one vehicle-sized space in it, and I hadn't seen any side pullouts on the track. If he had a truck, or ATV, or even a tent, I should have been able to see a light or hear something. "It's getting dark fast," I said. "You out here hunting?" He shrugged. "A little of this, little of that." Then he smiled wider, as if he'd said something charming. I remember that answer bothering me more than if he'd said nothing. The conversation had the shape of normal small talk, but every piece of it landed crooked. He wasn't drunk. He wasn't slurring or swaying. He just seemed to be performing friendliness
while all his attention stayed elsewhere. His eyes kept darting into the back of the van, then to the passenger side, then down toward the wheel well, like he was inventorying entry points. I said, "Well, thanks for checking." I meant it as a closing line. He didn't take it. He stayed planted by the door, still smiling, one hand resting lightly on the window frame, as if we were neighbors chatting over a fence. "You alone?" he asked. Every muscle in my back tightened. I laughed in that fake way again. "Just me and bad decisions." He didn't laugh. For a beat or two, neither of us said anything. Then he nodded once, stepped back from the window and said, "Well, holler if you need anything." He turned and walked around the front of the van, out of sight. I waited a few seconds and then peered through the passenger curtain. Nothing. No flashlight beam through the trees, no camp glow, no movement. I checked the back windows one by one, expecting to spot him heading toward some tent or parked vehicle I'd somehow missed. Nothing there either. Just the clearing, already darker than it should have been, and the first suggestion of night between the trunks. That was when I seriously considered leaving. I even sat in the driver's seat and put the key in the ignition. Then I looked at the windshield, saw my own face reflected back at me in the dim cab, pale and tired and embarrassed, and talked myself out of it. I told myself he'd obviously moved off quietly because he lived out here or hunted out here and knew the ground better than I did. I told myself I was letting too many horror story instincts hijack a perfectly ordinary encounter. Most of all, I told myself that driving blind back up that rutted track in full dark was its own risk. If I blew a tire or got stuck, I'd be much worse off. So I locked every door, shut off the front lights, and retreated to the back. I stayed alert for a long time. At some point, I made tea I didn't want just to have something warm to hold. I texted myself a note with the rough location out of habit, even though there was no signal. I checked the latch on the rear doors twice more. I slid the kitchen knife from the magnetic strip and kept it beside the bed. Eventually, with no further sounds outside, adrenaline started to flatten into exhaustion. I decided I would leave at first light. That decision comforted me enough that I changed into a sweatshirt and crawled under the blanket. I was just beginning to drift when I heard it. A soft shuffling sound from directly beneath the van, not to the side, not the tires settling, underneath. I went rigid. It came again, fabric against metal, a weight shifting carefully. Then a faint scrape, like something brushing the underside of the chassis. I sat up so fast my head clipped the overhead cabinet. The whole van seemed suddenly thinner, flimsier, a shell on top of whatever was below it. I crouched in the aisle, listening. Nothing. I told myself raccoon, porcupine, any number of things. Then there was a slow drag along the driver's side, low to the ground, followed by one distinct tap against the side panel. Not random, placed. I grabbed the van keys, slid into the cab, and flicked on the headlights. The beams filled the clearing. Trees, dust, empty ground. No man. I turned on the side floodlight too. Still nothing. I stared through the windshield hard enough that my eyes started aching. The clearing looked deserted. The yellow-white light cut across dirt and roots and the first low stirrings of fog rising between the trees. No movement anywhere.
I should have started the van then and left, rough track or not. Instead, I did something I can only describe now as the stupidest act of courage I've ever committed. I opened the driver's door and stepped outside. The cold hit me first, sharp enough to make my teeth hurt. Then the silence. Headlights behind me, whole clearing laid bare in washed out light, and still nothing moving in it. I took 3 slow steps around the front of the van, turning my head, scanning the trees, listening so hard that I could hear my pulse in the cartilage of my ears. "Hello?" I said, hating how small my voice sounded. No reply. I moved to the passenger side, half crouched without even meaning to, and listened again. Then came a short, dry sound from behind me. Not from the trees, from right under the van. I pivoted so fast my boots slid in the dirt. For 1 second, I saw nothing. Then instinct, or stupidity, made me drop to one knee and look underneath. Eyes looked back at me, close enough that I jerked backward with a sound between a gasp and a scream. The man was lying flat under the van, his cheek pressed into the dirt, one arm hooked around the chassis rail. He had somehow gotten himself up into the dead space under the center of the vehicle and stayed there, silently, while I'd been inside. In the angle of the headlights, his eyes reflected small and bright, like an animal's. He was smiling. Not big, not wild, just enough. I scrambled up and bolted for the driver's door. Behind me, I heard him laugh once, sharp and delighted, and then the scrape and thud of him crawling out fast. He hit the ground running. By the time I yanked the door open and threw myself into the seat, he was already at the side of the van. His hand slammed against the window so hard the glass boomed. Then again. Then his face appeared inches from mine, twisted now, no more attempt at friendliness at all. His mouth was open too wide. His front teeth were crooked, and one of them blackened near the gum. Up close, I could see dried blood in the cracks of his lower lip, and dirt packed under his nails. His eyes weren't crazy in the drunk or high sense. They were intent, focused, predatory. He shouted something I didn't understand and grabbed the door handle. I hit the lock and twisted the ignition. The engine coughed once, then caught. He yanked the handle with both hands. The door shuddered. I jammed the van into drive and stomped the gas. The rear wheels spun in dirt before finding purchase. The van lunged forward hard enough to throw me sideways. He lost his grip on the handle, but stayed beside me for several steps, slamming a fist against the side panel as he ran. Then he fell back out of the mirror. I didn't see him again for maybe 10 seconds. The track out was even worse in darkness than I'd feared. Headlights bounced wildly over ruts, roots, and branches. Cabinets burst open in the back. Something metallic crashed to the floor. I kept one white-knuckled hand on the wheel and the other locked around the shifter, half expecting each jolt to be the one that bottomed out the van or ripped a tire. Then the passenger side mirror caught movement. He was running through the trees parallel to the track, keeping up. He'd cut off the path and was moving through brush and trunks in short, vicious bursts, appearing in the headlights 1 second and vanishing the next. There was no way he should have been able to match the van on foot over that ground.
But every time I thought I'd lost him, he flashed into view again. Denim jacket pale under the beams, one arm pumping, the other held oddly tight to his body. The road narrowed between pines, and I had to slow for a washout. That was when something hit the back doors from outside with a heavy bang. I screamed. For one impossible second, I thought he'd climbed onto the van. I mashed the gas again, and the engine roared. Another bang hit from behind, then scraping, then silence. I didn't look back. I couldn't. I just drove. Halfway up the track, the headlights swept across something in the road. I had time to register only shape and color before the tire struck. The van jolted so hard I thought the axle had snapped. I almost lost the wheel. The object rolled under and spat out behind me with a wet thump. The rear view camera, which I'd forgotten even existed, flickered to life on the dash for a split second as the system detected impact. In that grainy little monitor, illuminated by red brake glow and dust, I saw what I'd hit. A deer carcass, or part of one. The torso had been split open from sternum to pelvis, ribs splayed like white fingers, organs mostly gone. One hind leg was missing entirely. The exposed meat was dark and slick, not old enough to be dry. As it rolled, the head lolled into frame, and the eyes had been removed. The sockets were empty black holes packed with pine needles. Something pale had been jammed into its open mouth. At the time, I thought bone. Later, I knew it had looked too square for that. More like teeth. I got the van back onto the main forest road at a speed that should have put me into a ditch. I kept driving until the road widened and the trees thinned enough that I could see farther than the end of the headlights. Only then did I glance into the side mirror again. No one behind me. I didn't stop. I drove nearly 40 miles all the way back to a small town whose name I barely remember and pulled into the lot of a gas station that was still open. My whole body was shaking. I was breathing so hard my chest hurt. There was blood on my knuckles from how tightly I'd gripped the wheel. A teenage clerk inside asked if I was okay, and I said I'd almost hit a deer. That was the first lie I told. I don't fully know why I didn't call the police right then. Part of it was shock. Part of it was the fear of sounding insane. A stranger under my van. A chase through public land. A carcass in the road, possible attempted break-in. It all sounded real enough until I imagined saying it out loud under fluorescent lights to a deputy who'd seen every variety of tourist panic before. I went to a motel instead. One of those single-story places with exterior doors, faded floral bedspreads, and a Bible in the nightstand drawer. I parked the van under the brightest light I could find, carried my bag in, jammed a chair under the knob even though motel doors open inward and that wouldn't have helped much, and sat on the bed with all the lights on until the sky began to pale. When it was finally morning, I called the rental company first, then county dispatch. A deputy came out along with a Forest Service law enforcement officer a few hours later. I gave them the access road as best I could, showed them the route on my offline map, described the man, described the van, described the clearing. Then we went outside to inspect the vehicle. There were handprints on the driver's side. Not nice, clear TV handprints. Smudged ones. Dirt, grease, and what looked like faint brownish streaks where fingers had gripped the panel near the handle. The handle itself was partially torn loose. The metal around it had been bent just enough to misalign the latch. On the back doors, there were 2 long vertical scratches through the paint down to bare metal. The deputy crouched by the rear bumper and frowned. "What did you hit?" I told him I thought a deer carcass. He nodded slowly and shined his light under the back. Something wet had dried in a spray pattern along the undercarriage and spare tire housing. There were also bits of hair caught in one seam and a few dark flecks that looked like tissue. The forest officer said, "Could be," in a tone that meant he wasn't sure.
Then the deputy stepped around to the passenger side, bent, and picked something off the rubber trim at the base of the door. He held it up between gloved fingers. A fingernail. Human-looking, ragged, split, with a bit of pink skin attached. He asked if it was mine. I almost laughed. They followed me back out there that afternoon in separate vehicles while the sun was still high. It took longer to find the turnoff than I expected, and for a while I thought I'd somehow gotten the whole location wrong. Then we found it. Same track, same trees, same descent into the clearing. But when we reached the end, the clearing looked smaller, meaner in daylight, less like a campsite and more like a wound in the trees. There was no man, no truck, no tent, no obvious sign that anyone had been living there. But the ground told a different story. There were tire marks older than mine, several sets actually, pressed deeper into the soil, toward the far edge of the clearing where trees grew close together. There were flattened places in the grass and dirt, as if things had been stored there and moved recently. The remains of an old fire pit sat near a stump, not ringed with stones but scraped raw into the earth. In it were blackened bones. The forest officer knelt by those first. At a glance, I thought animal, and maybe some were. Then he used a stick to turn one piece over, and I saw the rounded dome of a small skull, no bigger than a fist, cracked along one side and scorched black. Nearby lay a longer bone, with one end cleanly sawn or hacked through, not broken, cut. The deputy said, "Jesus." That was the first moment I felt truly justified in my terror. Until then, some part of me had still worried I was inflating a bad encounter into something worse. Standing there in full daylight, with armed law enforcement officers looking down at charred bone fragments, I knew I hadn't even seen the full shape of the thing. We spread out carefully. About 20 yards beyond the clearing, half hidden under brush, we found an old tarp stretched low between saplings. Under it were empty cans, filthy blankets, rotted food packaging, and more bones. A lot more. Deer, rabbit, coyote maybe. But mixed among them were pieces that were unmistakably human, even to me. The hinge of a jaw with a few teeth still fixed in it, 2 finger bones wired together with fishing line, and what looked horrifyingly like the top half of a hand, skin dried onto it like dark paper. The smell there was the same one I'd noticed on arrival, stronger now in the afternoon heat. Rot, meat, human waste, wet ash, old blood. Flies swarmed up when the tarp shifted. The deputy radioed for more units. They found another structure farther in, if you can call it that. Not a cabin, not a shack. More like a half-collapsed frame made from scavenged lumber and branches, draped with torn plastic sheeting. Inside was a mattress blackened with grime, a pile of clothing, several hunting knives, and a coffee can full of teeth. I wish I were exaggerating that. Human teeth.
Different sizes, different shades, some with fillings, some rotted nearly through, all piled together in rust flakes and dirt like somebody's collection jar. On one interior support post, someone had hammered in license plates from different states: Idaho, Montana, Colorado, Texas. Below them hung a ring of keys on wire, and spread across the dirt floor were photographs. Most of them weather damaged beyond recognition. A few were still legible. Campers near vehicles, a woman by a picnic table smiling at whoever held the camera, a man kneeling by a fire pit, a family of 4 in front of an RV. Some looked like ordinary vacation photos.
Others had clearly been taken from farther away, without the subjects knowing.
Long lens shots through trees or across roads, people unloading coolers, standing by trail maps, pumping gas, a little girl asleep in the passenger seat of an SUV. They laid them out on the hood of the deputy's cruiser while more officers searched the area. One of the photos was me. Not from that trip, earlier. I was standing outside the van rental place in Denver, signing paperwork beside the driver's door. It had been taken from across the lot, angled through the windshields of parked cars. I remember physically stepping back from the hood when I saw it, as if the photo itself might lunge at me. The deputy asked if I was sure. I was. Same jacket, same backpack, same exact moment I'd bent to set my coffee on the curb while digging for my license. That meant the man in the woods hadn't just happened upon me. He, or someone with him, had seen me before I ever reached that forest.
The search went on until dusk. They found blood on the plastic sheeting and on one of the knives. They found spent shell casings, butchered animal remains, scraps of clothing, and a shallow pit full of half-burned trash. They did not find the man. They did not find any complete human bodies. They did not find whatever had been placed in the deer's mouth, and according to the deputy who later called me, they also found no recent prints clear enough to support how close someone had been to the van the night before. The ground near the clearing was too hard and too disturbed. Too many old signs, not enough clean new ones. Which is why, for a few days afterward, part of me started doubting the sequence of things again. Not the man, I knew what I'd seen, but the details around him. Had he really been under the van that long? Had I mistaken one person for more than one? Had panic sharpened some images and warped others? Then 2 things happened. The first was mechanical. When I returned the van early, the rental company called me 3 days later, asking whether I had left anything in a hidden storage compartment beneath the rear bench. I said I hadn't. They sent me a photo. It was a small bundle of cloth stuffed deep into the compartment behind some wiring. Brown flannel, heavily stained. When the service tech pulled it open, a foul smell came out. Inside the cloth was a human ear. Not old, not mummified, fresh enough that dried blood still darkened the folds, and one tiny hoop earring remained in the lobe. The second thing happened a week after I got home to Ohio. I was back in my apartment by then, sleeping badly, pretending to friends that the trip had just gone weird without giving details. I told almost nobody about the photographs. I told no one about the teeth. I avoided the news because I was afraid to see some missing person case that might connect. One night, around 2 a.m., I woke to a soft tapping at my bedroom window. I lived on the 2nd floor. That's important. 2nd floor,
small building, parking lot below, no fire escape outside that side. The tap came again. 3 little clicks against the glass. I stayed frozen in bed, staring at the curtains. Then something dragged slowly downward across the window. Not hard enough to scratch, just enough to make a faint, rubbery whisper on the pane, as if damp fingers were testing the surface. I did not look. I waited until dawn. When I finally pulled the curtain back, there was nothing outside, but on the inside windowsill, tucked behind the blinds where it absolutely had not been before, lay a single object. A motel room key card. Not from my apartment, not from any chain I used. The cheap independent place I'd stayed the night after escaping. My room number had been written on it in black marker, and on the white strip below that, in shaky block letters pressed so hard the pen had nearly cut the plastic, were 3 words. You left early. I called the sheriff's office in Montana after that, then my local police, then the motel. Nobody could explain how a key card from a state halfway across the country had ended up inside my apartment. My local officer thought it was a prank by someone I knew. The motel manager insisted all used cards were deactivated and disposed of daily. The Montana deputy sounded tired when I told him. He asked if anyone else knew the motel name. I said no. That wasn't fully true. There was one person I had told more than I should have. My younger sister, on the phone 2 days after I got back. But she lived in North Carolina and would rather cut off her own hand than play some elaborate trauma prank on me. No charges ever came from the Forrest investigation while I was following it. They eventually linked some of the human remains to 2 open missing persons cases from different states, both involving people last known to be traveling through Montana in recreational vehicles. Beyond that, silence. A lot of law enforcement language about ongoing investigation, active leads, and not enough evidence to discuss specifics. The van company quietly settled with me over the damaged door and the early return. My therapist, because yes, I eventually got one, said hypervigilance was normal after predatory trauma. That phrase stuck with me. Predatory trauma. More accurate than fear, somehow. Fear is what happens during a bad event. Predatory trauma is what stays after your nervous system understands it was being studied. That's the part people miss when they hear a story like this. The scariest thing wasn't the chase. It wasn't the clearing. It wasn't even the man under the van. It was the realization that he had approached me politely first. He had smiled, introduced himself in effect, tested for other occupants, assessed the locks, looked into the back of the van. Then, when that wasn't enough, he'd hidden underneath it like an insect under a rock, waiting to see what I'd do next. That wasn't madness. That was method. There's one last thing I've never been able to explain away. About 6 months after the trip, I was cleaning out the backpack I'd taken with me. It had been shoved into a closet since I got home. I was finally trying to be a functional person again, doing laundry, sorting gear, making piles of things I might keep or donate. In a zippered side pocket I almost never used, I found a folded square of paper. Not my paper, not my handwriting. It smelled faintly of smoke and something sweet rotten underneath. Inside was a Polaroid. The image was dark and grainy, taken at night, but clear enough to understand. It showed the inside of my rented van from the rear doors facing forward. The bed was visible, the little sink,
the curtain separating the cab, and me sitting in the driver's seat with the engine running, lit by the dashboard glow, looking into the passenger mirror in terror while trying to drive out of the clearing. The photo had been taken from inside the van while I was escaping, which means one of two things had to be true. Either someone had been in that van with me while I tore out of the woods, or someone had entered it later, developed the photo somehow, implanted it in my bag after I got home. I don't know which possibility is worse. I turned the photo over. On the back, written in the same shaky block letters as the motel keycard, were 5 words. Next time, check the bed. I moved apartments a month later. I sold my car. I stopped taking road trips alone. And I have never once, since then, looked under a vehicle in the dark without feeling my heart try to climb out of my throat. Even now, every so often, I'll be in a grocery store parking lot or at a gas station off some interstate, and I'll catch sight of an ordinary man in a cap standing near the edge of the lot, watching people load coolers or bags into their cars. He'll look so normal that for a second I'll hate myself for even noticing. Then he'll turn just slightly, and I'll see how still he's standing, how little the smile reaches the rest of his face. I always leave immediately. Maybe I'm wrong every time. I hope I am. But last winter, after a snowstorm, I walked out to my current car before work and found tracks around it in the parking lot. Everyone else's cars just had the usual scatter of boot prints and tire marks from neighbors clearing windshields. Mine had those too, and one other set. There was a body-shaped impression in the snow along the driver's side, narrow and long, as if someone had lain on their back under the car and then wriggled out. 2 elbow marks, heel drags. A print where a cheek had rested, and on the dark, wet pavement beneath the center of the car, protected from the snowfall by the chassis, someone had written one sentence with a dirty fingertip. I still fit.